It's a real pleasure and honour to introduce Helen. Helen, I've known for many years. Helen was Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008, the first elected woman Prime Minister in New Zealand. She had a distinguished time in 3 terms as Prime Minister. And I think people look back fondly in New Zealand on what was a period of very effective, stable government in which New Zealand demonstrated quite a robust view of the world. And then she followed that with a period of 8 years as Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, a role which is both challenging and critical, as she took an organisation that needed considerable restructuring to enhance the capacity of those less developed countries to emerge into a better world. And she worked very hard, and I enjoyed working with her and seeing her in action in Africa on one occasion to deal with some of the most difficult development issues in the world. And I think everybody acknowledges that her time at UNDP was a time in which real contributions were made to development in very difficult situations. Helen continues to be active as a global citizen, making major contributions in all sorts of areas, including areas such as drug reform. And I'm very delighted that she's been willing to be our first keynote speaker today. Thank you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Peter Gluckman, for those very kind remarks. Greetings to our Japanese hosts, and good morning, everybody. And can I thank Sir Peter and INGSA for inviting me to address the conference, and what a pleasure to be hosted by Professor Tanaka, well known to me for his years as head of JICA. And I can say that Japan was one of UNDP's very, very best partners in all the world for supporting the kind of work that we did to advance human security. But when I saw the program for this conference, it was of interest to me for 2 reasons. One, of course, the focus it is placing on the importance of the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, I have been involved really since the first concept of designing these goals with advocacy around them, and I think the agenda and direction is right. It's a very complicated agenda, and left to development professionals, we probably would have come up with something that was less complicated and more measurable, and Professor Tanaka and I have exchanged ideas on that in the past, but it is what it is, and as I said, the direction is right. Secondly, of course, INGSA promotes overall the importance of evidence-informed policy making. And in an age where populism is often pointing decision makers in other directions, of course, we face the quite serious implications of that for both national policy making and achieving the global goals. As one who has occupied senior leadership positions for a lot of years in first domestic politics and then at UNDP, I myself have always depended greatly on and valued expert and free and frank advice. As a leader, you have to know a little about a lot, and you need to know who you're depending on, who knows a lot if you're to make good decisions. And I personally think that embarking on decision-making without such input is a very, very risky endeavour, which of course doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Plenty of decisions are made, unfortunately, without much evidence. So let me come then to the Sustainable Development Goals, the implementation of which, of course, would benefit enormously from both political will and from sound evidence to inform policy. The Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are a very ambitious agenda, and if implemented in full, they would transform the prospects of the world's peoples and secure the future of the world's ecosystems. But let's acknowledge up front that this is quite a tall order at the current time. A lot of barriers are standing in the way of success. And I will stress again and again as I speak that if we could draw on the best minds, the knowledge, the wisdom of the community that you represent, the way forward to clearing a number of these barriers would be faster. But in the sense of the major challenges, let me instance first the entrenched poverty and hunger which our world faces. On hunger, the number of hungry people in our world has risen for the past 3 years. Now stands at 821 million people, or 1 in every 9 human beings, which is rather a lot. Yet the 2030 agenda tells us we must eradicate hunger by 2030. And that can't be achieved on the current trend, which is going in the wrong direction. So very bold action is going to be needed to reverse that. Then we come to the failure of economies to generate enough employment and livelihoods for fast-growing populations. The level of global unemployment has stabilised at around 5.6%, but what we call vulnerable employment is on the rise, and the rate of reducing working poverty has slowed. There is considerable uncertainty around what the age of artificial intelligence will mean for employment prospects, and we are rather a long way from achieving Sustainable Development Goal 8, which aspires to full and productive employment and decent work for all by 2030. I think innovative social policy around basic safety nets and social protection is going to need to be part of reaching that goal going forward. Then there is the poverty of opportunity, along with the conflict and insecurity, which continues to drive a lot of informal migration, which in turn leads for many to exploitation and for others to death and injury where there is dangerous passage involved, as there clearly is across the Mediterranean and other areas. We have a Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is calling for the facilitation of orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people through planned and well-managed migration policies. But moral panic in a number of the destination countries currently stands in the way of achieving that. Then we see inequality on the rise almost everywhere in the world. That is the conclusion reached in the first World Inequality Report launched last year. Yet Sustainable Development Goal 10 tells us we must aim for measurable reductions in income inequality. So we have to turn that trend around, and I must say there are plenty of examples worldwide of what can be done to reduce inequality if we wish to apply those examples. We have the issues of environmental degradation, which are extremely serious, resulting in the significant biodiversity loss, desertification, and the warming climate, with so many consequences for human development. As the landmark 2015 Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission report on planetary health concluded, and I quote, "We have been mortgaging the health of future generations in order to realise economic and development gains in the present." Well, that isn't sustainable. We have 3 Sustainable Development Goals relating directly to the environment, including one specifically on climate change. All of these will need much more commitment from the UN's member states if they are to be achieved. Then, and this will be my last point, the high levels of conflict and citizen insecurity make sustainable development an unobtainable dream for many right now. By the end of last year, the numbers of people worldwide who are classed as forcibly displaced stood at 68.5 million, a rise of 2.9 million on the year before. Yet we have SDG 16 calling for the creation of peaceful and inclusive societies based on the rule of law. On current trends, we often seem to be moving away from, not towards, that objective. So just that short summary at a headline level of some of the challenges shows it is going to take extraordinary efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And those extraordinary efforts will require drawing on all relevant knowledge and capacities and organising governments and mobilising civil society, including academia and research institutions, to contribute to the big effort. This assumes, of course, that governments actually want to embrace the agenda and take steps to implement it. Doing that must mean being prepared to be open to analysis of and advice on what the challenges actually are and their scale, and then to consider responses based on that advice. And of course there are many governments prepared to follow such a path, but for others, a dispassionate analysis of challenges and options is just one of those inconvenient truths. In a post-truth or fake news setting, science will be challenged, and so will the solutions that are based on it. Let me instance 3 areas where I believe the evidence points one way, but where populism and/or denial and/or fear of short-term political consequences point in another. The first, and I guess most obvious, is climate change. We have the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change suggesting that our world is on track for more than 3 degrees Celsius warming by the end of this century. To stay below the Paris Agreement target of the 1.5 degrees, there would need to be what's described as a World War II level mobilisation to stop the use of fossil fuels and to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a large scale. But one has to ask, how likely is that when very major economies are so far from executing such decisions? The role of coal, for example, is once again applauded by the United States Federal Administration. In China, it's reported that local authorities are proceeding with coal plant construction at scale, despite the central government trying to rein it in, and coal-powered plants are reported to be making a comeback in government thinking in India. Overall, the scientific consensus on climate change points to the need for major change in the way the world produces and consumes, but the short-term political costs of action so often lead to delayed or little action. Yet, as the 2006 Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change told us, we either pay now for the energy and other transitions required, or we pay much later and for far less optimal results. My second example would be on policy on drugs. The 2030 Agenda exhorts us to leave nobody behind in development. But one group which is consistently marginalised and often demonised is that of people who use drugs. A prohibitionist approach is mandated by the United Nations conventions, which actually refer to drug addiction as an evil. And it's a short step from that to seeing those who use drugs as evil and therefore deserving of punishment. Yet the steps taken over decades now with the aim of wiping out drug use and illicit supply have manifestly failed, and the classification of drugs bears little relationship to assessments of their potential for harm. So I think this is an area where we need to hear much more from science and much less from moralisers and populists. Drug policy in most countries is neither based on science nor informed by evidence of what works. Portugal, which has in effect defied the intent of the international conventions, decriminalised personal use and possession of drugs, and put in place major harm reduction measures, has seen its rate of drug-related deaths drop from being the highest in Western Europe in the 1990s to the lowest today. There has to be a message in that. My third area is addressing inequality. High levels of inequality place enormous strains on social cohesion and have particularly poor outcomes for the most disadvantaged in such societies. But often governments are resistant to acting on the evidence of such social stress, even preferring to blame the victims of it for their plight. I believe that being effective in tackling inequality will mean accepting that market mechanisms do not work for all in accessing housing and other services, and that the state must be a player if more equitable outcomes are to be secured. The evidence of what works in this area, however, such as intervention to secure affordable housing supply and sustaining universal health coverage, a cause much promoted by Japan, is so often dismissed on ideological grounds. Of course, there are other examples of policy driven by ideology and belief rather by science and evidence. One could instance migration policy leading to human rights abuses, despite the evidence that migration generally is of benefit to both source and destination countries if properly organised. Take, for example, penal policy, prison policy, leading to unnecessarily high levels of incarceration in a number of countries. Take education, where often populism leads to a narrow exams and results focus rather than to education for the critical thinking and innovation our societies need to prosper today. So my appeal to policymakers seeking to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and national development aspirations will be always to seek the very best advice they can, to evaluate it rigorously, to make their decisions accordingly, and to monitor the outcomes so that course corrections can be made as required. Further, my advice will always be for governments to organise themselves to meet the demands of policy making across complex sets of issues, which are not the domain of any one sector or ministry. For example, lifting health status is about far more than access to services and treatments. It very much relates to tackling poverty, lifting education levels, having a clean environment, having peace in the society and around one's country. Tackling climate change involves huge efforts across energy, transport, environment, agriculture, forestry, science and research, economic development and finance ministries, together with engaging the social policy and other ministries. And the perspectives and the engagement of women and youth, minorities of all kinds, the most marginalised, who are most dependent on an equitable climate, must be sought. Getting cross-departmental coordination and ensuring that each department in government can contribute meaningfully will mean resourcing their policy and advisory capacities, something on which government science advisors are themselves well placed to advise. And let us not overlook the critical role of local government. Often the mandate and funding for action on the issues central to sustainable development will be lying at the subnational level. I think these capacities also need to be applied to foresight around the future, to scanning the horizon continually for the new issues, the challenges, the opportunities, the threats to which countries must respond. Building resilience into societies and systems, the capacity to adapt and to innovate as new circumstances arise are critical in a world where ever more people are exposed to risk from weather-related and other disasters, and where economic globalisation is exposing countries to events over which they have no control whatsoever, but around which they just have to manage. The capacity to do all that may well not be available from and within standing government capacities. And so governments must be encouraged to interact with the expertise that is in the academic and research communities so that all knowledge relevant to decision-making can be tapped. So to conclude, as a realist, I consider that very major, complex and interlinked challenges are standing in the way of achieving both the SDGs and national aspirations for human development. As an optimist, I know that to address those challenges, we need a sound knowledge base, good analysis, and the right policy tools. All of you who work at the science policy interface have critical roles to play in supporting the design of evidence-informed policy, which can rise to meet global and national goals. And I wish the conference very well in raising aspirations for what government science advisors and networks can contribute to that process. Thank you very much.
We've got time for one or two questions for Helen Clark. Any questions from the floor? Helen, can I ask, do you have a view on the UN system and its lack of formal input of science into the central part of the system? The last Science Advisory Board only reported to UNESCO in Paris and did not get engaged transactionally in these fundamental matters. And is there a need within the UN system for greater input in a more structured way?
Yes, I think it would be very helpful, and it's disappointing to hear that Ban Ki-moon's initiative has not been followed through on. Ban Ki-moon was very committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and engaged, very widely. And yes, of course, there are networks that are engaged with the UN around the goals from the scientific and technology communities, but nothing with the status of what Ban Ki-moon envisaged that it should be. So I think INGSA should continue to advocate for following through on that, really replicating at the global level what has been able to be created at the national level in a number of countries with formal scientific advice and input.
Hi, Maggie Poker from Asia Research News. It's a rather depressing state of the world right now, and I was very pleased to hear about the positive note on Portugal. Do you have any others?
Well, look, it's a glass half full, isn't it? I never look at the glass half empty, but our headlines are dominated by shocking, horrible, disturbing things. On the other hand, there are countries doing very interesting things. I mean, for example, who would have predicted a year ago that both Ethiopia and Rwanda would appoint half their cabinets as women? Now, immediately you tweet about that, people say, oh, what about merit? They never asked that question when 100% of cabinets were male, right? The women are there and they're ready. And I think that the movement forward of women is something that's very exciting in a range of countries. And without doubt, where countries have been able to preserve peace and stability, a number are making quite significant gains. But we live in such an interconnected world that you can be getting along okay within your borders, and then something from completely outside them will knock you sideways. I mean, think, for example, of Kenya, a middle-income country, Nairobi, such an important hub for industry and commerce and transport, and yet all the time the pressure from Al-Shabaab sort of coming down from the north. So I think that it's always important to be optimistic, because we see so many examples of countries that are getting on with it, policies that are working, some progress towards goals, but then we have a number of countries in such turmoil. both in the Western world and in developing countries. And it's really navigating through that and all the uncertainty that creates, which is very challenging at the moment. It's a different context in which these early years of the Sustainable Development Goals are being pursued to that of, say, the early years of the 21st century when the Millennium Development Goals were launched, and we were in rather more stable times than we are today.
One last question in the middle there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Matthias Kaiser from the University of Bergen in Norway. Thank you for an interesting talk. Now, coming from the science, it is very easy to point to difficulties with the decision makers. You talk about the post-truth area, but we are talking about the science policy interface that has two directions. Looking back towards the science, is the science in a state where we actually can provide the advice that we need? Very often people pretend that there is a scientific opinion, a scientific consensus. But looking into the science, what we find is there's a great diversity, there is dissent all over. So what are the structural challenges that you see for science to be able to contribute to that?
Well, I go back to what Peter Gluckman said about putting the options out there. We don't have perfect knowledge in many areas, but we have a lot of information around which we can formulate choices and options and, if you like, make our best guess based on what we know. So that would be the way that I would approach it. Not that there are automatic answers that if you do this, that will happen, but, well, that was done there. We know this. Should we try that? How do we innovate and adapt? I think that is also evidence-informed policy making, accepting that we operate with levels of uncertainty, which may be great or not so great.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very, very much for coming out of a very busy schedule. She was in Beirut yesterday, Vietnam tomorrow.